So the weakling was a weapon all along. Look who finally showed their teeth. You can almost hear the confusion in the air, can't you? That sharp inhale from people who were so sure they had you figured out, the ones who skimmed you at first glance and decided you were harmless, too quiet, too polite, too accommodating to ever be a problem. They filed you away mentally as someone small, someone manageable, someone they could interrupt, overlook, talk over, and quietly benefit from without resistance. They mistook your restraint for weakness, and that was their mistake. Because from the very beginning, you were never what they thought you were. You weren't passive. You weren't naïve. You weren't unaware. You were observing. While they were busy performing dominance, you were studying patterns. While they were busy assuming control, you were learning how that control actually worked. You watched who spoke the loudest when they felt insecure. You noticed who needed credit the most and who collapsed without attention. You paid attention to the small tells, the inconsistencies, the way people revealed themselves when they thought no one important was watching. They thought you weren't paying attention because you didn't react. They thought you didn't understand because you didn't argue. They thought you lacked boundaries because you didn't announce them. But silence was never incapacity. Silence was your vantage point. There's a particular kind of arrogance that comes from believing someone else is beneath you. It makes people sloppy, careless. It makes them speak too freely, act too boldly, cross lines they wouldn't dare cross with someone they respected. And you let them, not because you couldn't stop them, but because you were learning exactly who they were when they felt untouchable. You saw how quickly kindness was taken for granted, how easily your patience became an expectation, how your consistency became something they felt entitled to. They assumed you'd always be there, always available, always understanding. They assumed your role was fixed and your value capped, replaceable, convenient. What they never considered was that you were choosing restraint, not living in it. You weren't weak. You were controlled. You weren't small. You were compressed. You weren't disengaged. You were gathering information. And slowly, without ceremony, something began to change. It wasn't loud. There was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just subtle shifts that made the atmosphere around you feel different. You stopped filling silences that weren't yours to fill. You stopped correcting people who misunderstood you. You stopped chasing clarity from those committed to confusion. You stopped explaining your intentions to people who benefited from misinterpreting them. That's when the dynamic started to crack. Because people who rely on control depend on predictability. They need reactions. They need emotional access. They need you to play the part they assigned you. And the moment you stopped performing that role, they lost their footing. They felt it before they understood it. That unease. That sense that something they used to rely on was no longer available. You were still present, but no longer accessible. Still polite, but no longer pliable. Still calm, but no longer controllable. You didn't raise your voice. You lowered your tolerance. You didn't attack. You disengaged. You didn't demand respect. You removed access. And suddenly, the same people who once dismissed you started paying closer attention. Conversations shifted when you entered the room. Assumptions had to be rechecked. The jokes landed differently. The confidence they once carried around you started to falter because they could feel it now. You weren't operating from the same place anymore. They realized too late that while they were busy trying to dominate the moment, you were positioning yourself for the long term. You weren't thinking about winning arguments. You were thinking about leverage. You weren't focused on being liked. You were focused on being free. That's when it became obvious that the version of you they thought they understood no longer existed. You stopped reacting on demand. You stopped offering emotional labor to people who never returned it. You stopped shrinking to keep others comfortable. And the absence of your old behavior spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. People who once felt powerful around you now felt exposed. Not because you attacked them, but because without your compliance, their influence meant nothing. Their tactics only worked when you participated. Their narratives only held weight when you tried to defend yourself against them. Once you stepped back, they were left alone with their own behavior, and that's when things unraveled. They over-explained. They escalated. They contradicted themselves, trying to regain a sense of control that was never actually theirs to begin with. And in doing so, they revealed exactly what you had already documented internally. The insecurity, the ego, the dependence on dominance instead of substance. You didn't expose them. They exposed themselves. That's the part they still can't wrap their heads around. You didn't need revenge. You didn't need to retaliate. You didn't need to prove anything. You simply stopped feeding a system that required your silence, your patience, and your emotional availability to survive. And without that fuel, it collapsed. Your transformation wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined. It wasn't aggressive. It was deliberate. It wasn't driven by anger. It was driven by clarity. You chose to grow instead of react, to observe instead of engage, to invest your energy where it actually compounded instead of where it was drained. And that choice changed everything. Now, when people look at you, they're not sure where to place you anymore. You don't fit the old category. You don't respond the way they expect. You don't move on the timeline they're used to. You're no longer available for manipulation, and that unsettles people who built their confidence on being able to control others. They can feel that you're no longer playing the same game, and what makes it worse for them is that you didn't leave in a dramatic exit. You stayed just long enough to outgrow the dynamic entirely. Your silence became authority. Your distance became definition. Your consistency became credibility. And the more grounded you became, the more irrelevant their opinions grew. You didn't need to announce your strength. It revealed itself naturally the moment you stopped giving it away. And now, the ones who once saw you as harmless are forced to confront a quiet truth they never anticipated. You were never weak. You were waiting. And what you've stepped into now isn't something they can interrupt, overlook, or take from you. It's something that continues to expand with or without their understanding. You didn't show your teeth to threaten. You showed them because you no longer needed to hide who you were. And the shift that caused hasn't finished unfolding yet, because this isn't the end of the story. It's just the point where they finally realized they were never dealing with what they thought they were. And here's the part they still don't understand. The part that keeps looping in their minds long after the room empties and the noise dies down. You didn't change overnight. You didn't flip a switch and become something else. What happened was slower, quieter, and far more unsettling than a sudden transformation. You stopped leaking energy. You stopped negotiating your worth. You stopped translating yourself for people who were committed to misunderstanding you. That's when your presence started to feel heavier without you doing anything louder. They began to notice the gaps first. The spaces where your explanations used to be. The absence of your immediate responses. The way you no longer rushed to smooth things over, no longer softened truths to keep others comfortable. Those gaps unsettled them, because gaps invite projection. And when people project, they reveal their fears. You were no longer predictable, and unpredictability, when paired with calm, makes people nervous. Before, they could rely on your reactions. They knew which buttons to press, which tone to use, which narrative would pull you back into the familiar role. You were dependable in ways that benefited everyone but you. And when that dependability disappeared, so did their leverage. They couldn't provoke clarity out of you anymore. They couldn't bait you into emotional labor. They couldn't control the pace of the interaction. You set the tempo now slowly, deliberately, on your terms. That's when they started revisiting old moments, replaying conversations, looking for the exact point where things shifted. They want a timestamp, a reason, a mistake they can correct, but there isn't one. The shift didn't happen in a single moment. It happened every time you chose not to respond when you could have. Every time you chose to observe instead of engage. Every time you redirected your focus back to your own growth instead of defending your position. You didn't take anything from them. You simply stopped giving, and without your participation, the entire dynamic collapsed under its own weight. They thought power came from being louder, faster, more assertive. They thought dominance was about occupying space. What they didn't anticipate was someone who understood that real authority comes from selectivity, from knowing when not to speak, from choosing where to invest attention and where to withdraw it completely. Your calm became disruptive because it wasn't passive. It was intentional. It said, without words, that you were no longer available for the roles they needed you to play. Here's the uncomfortable truth. They're circling around but haven't fully named yet. You didn't win by outperforming them. You won by outgrowing the environment that made their behavior effective in the first place. You stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. You stopped competing in systems that rewarded noise over substance. You stopped proving yourself to audiences that had already decided how they wanted to see you. Instead, you built quietly, skill boundary by boundary, choice by choice. And while they were busy reacting to surface level shifts, you were restructuring your entire internal framework. You learned how to regulate your emotions instead of explaining them. You learned how to hold your ground without hardening your heart. You learned how to walk away without burning bridges, knowing that distance alone was enough. That kind of growth doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything it touches. Now, when they try to interact with you the old way, something feels off. The tactics don't land. The assumptions don't stick. The familiar scripts fail. They're speaking a language you no longer respond to, and that disorientation unsettles them more than open resistance ever could. Because resistance gives them something to push against. Silence gives them nothing. They start questioning themselves, not openly, not at first, but internally. They wonder why their words didn't carry the same weight, why their presence didn't command the same attention, why you didn't flinch, why you didn't chase clarity or reassurance or approval. They tell themselves you've changed, and they're right, but not in the way they think. You didn't become colder. You became clearer. You didn't become distant. You became discerning. You didn't become hard. You became solid. And solidity doesn't need to prove itself. What really shifted the balance was your consistency. You didn't waver. You didn't oscillate between engagement and withdrawal. You didn't send mixed signals. You moved forward with the same quiet resolve, day after day, until your behavior rewrote the narrative without a single argument. People who once spoke over you now hesitate. People who once dismissed your ideas now listen more closely. People who once assumed access now realize they have none. Not because you announced a boundary, but because you embodied one. And boundaries that are embodied don't invite debate. They're left with a strange realization. The version of you they were comfortable controlling is gone. And the version that remains isn't interested in settling scores or correcting perceptions. You're focused on alignment, on building a life that doesn't require constant self-translation, on choosing environments that recognize your value without needing to be convinced. That's what makes this irreversible. You didn't just change how you relate to them. You changed how you relate to yourself. And once that relationship stabilizes, external dynamics lose their grip. They may still talk about you, wonder about you, try to decode what happened, but those conversations no longer reach you. They happen outside your field of concern, like distant echoes from a room you've already left. You're not hiding, you're not avoiding, you're simply no longer available for narratives that don't align with who you've become. And here's the part that lands the hardest for them. You didn't need to dominate to dismantle the dynamic. You didn't need to expose anyone. You didn't need to raise your voice or lower your standards. You let time, consistency, and clarity do the work. Your growth made the old games obsolete. That's why they feel smaller around you now. Not because you're trying to make them feel that way, but because your presence highlights the difference between performance and substance, between control and confidence, between noise and direction. You didn't show your teeth to threaten. You showed them because you no longer needed to keep them hidden to survive. And once they saw that, they realized something they can't undo. You're no longer someone they can shape, manage, or define. You're moving forward with intention now, with selectivity, with a sense of direction that doesn't require permission. And that trajectory, once established, doesn't loop back. They're left standing at the edge of a dynamic that no longer exists, trying to figure out how they lost control without ever being confronted. And you're already several steps ahead. Not because you're chasing distance from them, but because you're moving towards something that demands your full attention. This isn't closure, it's progression. And what comes next will make the version of you they underestimated feel like a distant memory.